This, ladies and gentlemen, is a special sideboard. It's not Danish or even Scandinavian, but the first time I restored one of these a few years ago, it ended up being a kind of a breakthrough project for me that really gave me the confidence to start taking on bigger jobs. So, when I saw another one in the local listings a few weeks back, I instantly saw it as a chance to relive that experience. In fact, I was so excited that I barely even checked it over before buying it because I was already committed to seeing what kind of results I could achieve doing it all again for the second time. As far as the design itself goes, it's a medium-sized mid-century teak sideboard or credenza from a small workshop here in Germany by the name of Friedrich Bechmann, which I would place somewhere around the late 50s or perhaps early 60s. It has these curled over pulls at the top of the drawers, which are definitely a German design element, but then it also features these two sliding doors, which is a design feature more commonly associated with the Scandinavian sideboards. As you can see here, most of the veneer was in fairly good condition, but the corners and edges had been beaten up pretty badly, and so I knew I was going to have to spend a lot of time rebuilding the corners and blending them back in again. At the back, somebody had tried to repair one of the corners with some melting wax, which is actually a good idea when you don't want to sand and refinish, but all of that wax would have to come out before I could rebuild it properly with epoxy. The real star of the show with this design though is the lateral orientation of the veneer across the front, so that you get this beautiful teak wood grain flowing continuously across these sliding doors and onto the drawers. This is a really rare design feature for this style of furniture, and the minimalistic design and styling of the sideboard itself really puts the lateral lines of the wood grain in the spotlight. The interior was in fairly good condition, although there was some dried glue on the internal shelf and some cable holes drilled in the back wall, which is not uncommon for these pieces, but I'd never seen an actual power plug adapter fitted to the inside before. Along with the wax repair on the corner, this suggests to me that this thing had definitely been worked on at some point in its life, possibly even refinished, and it had probably seen many different owners over the years. The first one of these that I restored was definitely in better condition than this one, probably because it had been sitting in a barn for most of its life, and the veneer was also darker, possibly due to lack of UV exposure. But in any case, by the time I got to stripping the old finish off this one, I had already decided to try and darken it and basically try to make it look a little more like the first one. I'm not 100% sure on what the original finish was on this, but it looked to me like it could have been blonde shellac. Even in its aged and faded condition, the finish still had a certain warm glow to it, and when it came time to remove with the stripper, there were some tricky spots, and I could see that the finish had really bonded to the surface instead of just forming a film like lacquer or polyurethane. Even in scrubbing everything down with mineral spirits, there were still some really stubborn patches, but whatever it was had done a good job of protecting the veneer, because I don't think there were any actual scratches on the whole sideboard, although I did have to get the scraper out before I could move on to the sanding. Because the paint stripper is a water-based product, it does tend to leave the surface a little bit damp, and so most of the time I'll just let it dry off overnight before starting the sanding. But this is also a good opportunity to do any repairs which also may need to dry out. The Quickwood Instant Epoxy is a product I've been using more and more these days, as it dries very quick and very hard, and so it's perfect for rebuilding corners and edges which need to be firm and durable. I have had a couple of problems with it in the past, but I think you really just need to work it a lot in your fingers to make sure that the activator or hardening agent is mixed in properly and can do its job. When I restored the first one of these, I was unable to remove the undercarriage, and in taking a look at this one, I realized it's because it was glued on rather than being attached with screws. Somehow though, this one had been removed, and it definitely needed to be repaired before I reattached it again. Often, if I'm unsure as to whether a piece has already been finished before, I'll turn the speed on the sander down to about 70%, just to see how it works and how quickly it's lifting that top layer off. In this case, there was still plenty of residual finish on the surface, which was really resistant to the sander, even though I was using 150 grit. And even when I turned it up to full power again, it took quite a long time just to complete the first scuff sand and get the last of that finish off the surface. When it comes to doing smaller areas like drawer fronts, I'm normally able to just hand sand with 180 and leave it at that, but areas like the corners which have been repaired with epoxy are always going to need a lot of special attention. I would say that this type of damage is probably the most common when it comes to this design style, which is pretty basic and straightforward. When I sold the previous one of these a few years ago, I got a message from the buyer about a week later saying that they'd actually smashed in this very same corner here while carrying it into the house, and in the end I actually went over there and repaired it for them. One thing that can help the repair though is adding a little texture to the epoxy with a box cutter, just to create more of a wood grain like effect, which can pay off later on when I come back to do the color work and blend it out again. What you'll notice when it comes to the Scandinavian designs from the bigger or more established designers is that they generally use solid wood edge banding on the joins and all the leading edges, which doesn't just look good but also adds a higher degree of strength and durability. This one here is still definitely a beautiful design, but the edge banding here is just regular veneer, so you do have to be careful. With the sanding out the way, I wanted to check the veneer before I moved on to the staining, as it was still looking a little bit patchy from all that stubborn finish that I had a hard time getting out. By wiping everything down with some mineral spirits, which is what I use to cut the stain with, I can see how the surface is going to react to the stain and whether there are any blotches or patches which might stand out. Rather than using my regular teak wood stain for this, I opted this time for Brazilian rosewood, basically because it's a little darker and that's what I wanted for this project. While the teak tends more towards a warm golden brown, the rosewood stain is much more of a dark, rich orange, which I think is going to really complement this veneer and allow me to darken the overall color tone without making it any less vibrant. I have definitely used this stain in the past and regretted it because it can potentially be so dark, but I've found that if I cut it right down to about 30% with mineral spirits, that seems to be the sweet spot with most timbers and veneers. One area where I feel that I could improve is my touch-ups. The last few pieces where I did touch-up work have been okay, and the buyers have all been happy, but I still felt that they were not as good as they perhaps could have been, and so I decided that I wanted to up my game a little bit on this project. What I'm doing here is using acrylic paints to build a basic wood grain effect by mixing the acrylic paint to create both a primary color and a secondary color. I add the secondary color first, wait for it to dry, and then add the primary color on top, just feathering it on really gently with the brush until it starts to blend into the surrounding wood grain. There is a lot of trial and error in doing these touch-ups though, from mixing the paints to get a color match to trying to wipe off the excess without wiping off too much, and this was just the first part of it. With the paint drying, I turned my attention to the undercarriage. The repair had been successful and I had already given it a quick hand sand off camera, followed by a wipe down with some wood stain because it was basically still in good condition and there was really no need to strip the finish off completely. For this piece I mixed up a custom blend of shellac using about 80% amber and 20% garnet just to darken it a little. All that was really necessary with the undercarriage was to just add on a couple of thin coats of the existing finish to rejuvenate it a little bit. Before reinstalling it, I wanted to give the underside a quick clean with the sander though. This is something I've gotten into a habit of doing, and while it's definitely not necessary, I feel it's a nice touch which shows respect for the design and adds value to the piece. With 40mm screws, I then calculated the depth I would have to sink the screws into the undercarriage and then used a larger drill bit to create the sinks before drilling a pilot hole for the screws. These pieces have a tendency to warp or bend a little over time, and this one was no exception. But as the apron or frame of the undercarriage was made from very stiff plywood, I felt that screwing it back on really straight and firm might help even it out again. At the very least, it's going to have a stabilizing effect on the structure, and as long as this thing doesn't get thrown down a flight of stairs, it's not going to come apart again. Now it was finally time to move on to finishing the rest of the sideboard with shellac. This is the same batch that I mixed up for the undercarriage and the same treatment, with 2 light coats to seal the surfaces and enhance the color. As always, I try to keep the finish looking as light and as natural as possible, rather than filling out all the grain and building up a high gloss sheen. This was definitely a moment of truth for the repaired areas though, because the shellac can often highlight any inconsistencies when it comes to the color and texture. So all I could really do in this spot here was to add some concentrated rosewood stain over the shellac to darken and blend out the acrylic paint, and then let it dry off overnight. It was then just a case of coming back to add some detail and some definition. I recently bought myself a couple of these Mohawk brush tip pens to try out, which definitely took a little bit of getting used to, but I found that if you really just feather them across the surface as gently as possible, you can really start getting some pretty realistic results. There's still a lot of trial and error involved, and you generally want to sort of smudge it and blur it a bit with some tissue paper, but these pens are basically designed to paint on the pores of the wood grain, and they've definitely helped me up my game a bit with this project. Ever since I bought this piece, I had been debating with myself as to what I would use for a top coat. Although I love the Waterlox tung oil varnish, it is a very expensive product that involves a lot of drying time, and so I opted to go with the Mini Wax Wipe-On polyurethane. I've used this in a couple of projects, and until now I hadn't really been all that impressed by it, but I have to say I was pleasantly surprised with the results on this one. The thing I'm always trying to avoid is creating a visible clear film over the surface, because I don't want to make it look cold or artificial, but I bought the warm satin variant of this product because it claimed to give a hand-oiled look, and after 2 thin coats it definitely didn't disappoint. With the top coat drying, I used the opportunity to get all of the little finishing touches and smaller details out the way. As long as the interior is in relatively good condition, then I'll just clean it and freshen it up a little bit with some lacquer reviver and some beeswax polish. But when the felt inlays are this badly damaged, they definitely need to be replaced. I know that most people nowadays probably wouldn't use them to store cutlery and glasses, but there's no way they can be left like this. After the poly had dried off for a couple of days, I gave it a quick sand with 320 and a polish with the orange oil and beeswax polish. Not 100% necessary with poly or lacquer, but I do like to get it really smooth. And voila, done. Is this one as good as the first one I did? Well, that's hard to say, and I know that the first one definitely has some sentimental value, but considering what I had to work with here, I'm pretty happy with the overall result. Thanks for watching.